All right, circling back to Indonesia, where there's been a major shakeup in government. President Prabowo Subianto replacing several ministers in an unprecedented cabinet reshuffle.
5 ministers have lost their jobs, including longtime finance chief Sri Mulyani Indrawati, who is replaced by economist Purbaya Sadiwa. The changes come as President Prabowo faces mounting political and social pressures in the wake of deadly unrest over the last 2 weeks.
At least 10 people have been killed nationwide. The protests were initially sparked by a new allowance package for lawmakers, but quickly evolved into a broader movement against economic inequality and privileges for the country's political elites. For more, let's speak now to Dr. Dirk Tomsa, Associate Professor in Politics and the head of the Department of Politics, Media and Philosophy at Trobe University. Thank you very much for joining us, Professor. Firstly, I want to get your take on the timing and political calculation behind this reshuffle.
Yeah, good morning. Yeah, the timing now appears as if it's a direct response to the protests. And you could argue that there is an element to that. So if you look at the ministers that have been kicked out of the cabinet now, certainly the finance minister and the coordinating minister for security affairs, they are related to the responsibilities that triggered these protests. But talk about a cabinet reshuffle has also been around for a bit longer. And so this was probably also an opportune moment for Prabowo to send a message to his cabinet that what he regards as underperformance or damaging acts done by cabinet ministers will not be tolerated. So he used this opportunity to, dismiss not just one or two, but make it a bit larger and therefore send a message. But as I said, it's been sort of talked about for a little while, and therefore for Prabowo it was a good opportunity to send a message.
Yeah, can we elaborate on that point and take a closer look at the ministerial posts involved in this reshuffle? So we've got Finance Minister, Minister of Defense, and also the newly formed Ministry of Hajj and Umrah. Professor, why do you think these portfolios specifically, and what does it tell us about the president's objectives?
Yeah, I mean, clearly the outstanding one and the one that's been most talked about is, of course, the finance ministry. Sri Mulyani has been a very long-serving minister, highly respected in the international community, and has been credited with very responsible financial and fiscal management since she's been in that office. So replacing her is a bold move in a sense that it sends a message because, as you may remember, during the riots, her house was ransacked. So she became a bit of a symbol of the inequality in Indonesia, not so much that she was displaying all this wealth like some of the other DPR members, but because she was in charge of the finance ministry. So long heralded as not a popular figure perhaps, but a respected figure. Now her standing was certainly seen in a different light. But replacing her, Purbaya, the newly appointed finance minister, he doesn't have the experience that Sri Mulyani has had. And what worried me a bit is that one of his first statements after being appointed was that his goal would be to improve economic growth, increase economic growth rates to 6 to 7%. And once that would be achieved, the protests would die down because the protesters would just be, looking for jobs. That worries me because these protests were not just about economic growth. Economic growth has been decent in Indonesia for quite a while, around the 5%. But it hasn't done anything to change these perceptions of inequality, of massive discrepancies between the wealth of a tiny few and the situation of the vast majority of Indonesians who struggle with the cost of living, with housing, etc.
Okay.
So, therefore, that's been a bit of a worrying statement, I would say.
Okay, and Professor, since we're talking about the new finance minister, as you pointed out, he has ruled out new taxes, promising 6 to 7% growth and expanding spending as well. Is that a feasible plan, though? Where does the fiscal space come from?
Yeah, that is a good question, one that he will have to tackle now that he is in office. It's a balancing act that will be very, very difficult to achieve. Many of Prabowo Subianto's programs are very expensive, and in order to finance them, there had been various austerity measures already in place, which has contributed to the discontent that you saw in the streets now. So the money isn't really there. So just increased spending will not be easy. The cabinet reshuffle in itself now has rocked is a bit strong, but has certainly sent a level of uncertainty and insecurity into markets because he is more of an unknown quantity than Sri Mulyani was. And whether he will be able to maintain this fiscal responsibility while at the same time having to deliver on new programs in order to address the demands of the protesters, that will indeed be very, very difficult.
On the protesters, some have said that this dissatisfaction with the president stems from his focus on rural development, that his urban development agenda has really fallen short. What do you think? Is there too much focus on rural issues? Do you think more attention needs to be on the challenges facing the cities in the country?
Yeah, the cities are certainly facing enormous challenges. And one of the underlying dynamic in this protest is that the middle class in Indonesia has been shrinking, right? And that's a lot in the urban areas. There is a lot of discontent about the situation on the job market, on the housing market. The rising cost of living makes people who have had a fairly good standard of living in the last few years has made them struggle now. And so urban areas are facing enormous social challenges. There's also additional challenges with environmental pollution in most of the bigger cities. So urban areas certainly do need a lot of attention, but you're right that Prabowo's government has been focusing a lot on rural development in the last few months, and I guess it needs perhaps a bit more of a balance. And certainly a lot of the protests have been concentrated in the big cities. So we see that that is where a lot of discontent is. I'm not saying that there is no discontent in the rural areas, but certainly we can see a lot of anger building up in urban areas, partly because of economic conditions, but also partly because of that's where a lot of people are engaged in politics, is where they are monitoring what's happening, and they see that while their situation is not improving, the wealth of the rich and the politicians is increasing. And as you said in your intro, the increase or this new housing allowance was the initial trigger for the protests, but it was sort of following up from discontent that had been brewing for years, basically. There were earlier protests already this year, last year. It goes back 4 or 5 years when we had the protests against the weakening of the Anti-Corruption Commission and the Omnibus Law.
All right. Thank you so much for your insights today, Professor. That's Dr. Dirk Tomsa, Associate Professor in Politics from the Department of Politics, Media and Philosophy at Trobe University.